If you are hearing this, then understand it without hesitation, because this is not a message about potential. It is a message about confirmation. And what is being confirmed right now is not something you are about to do, but something you have already done. Something that placed you in a position that most people never reach, not because they lack opportunity, but because they lack the ability to follow through when it matters most. And what separates you in this moment is not intention, not belief, not desire, but execution at the exact point where it counted. You didn't just think about it. You didn't just feel it. You acted on it. And that is what changed everything. This wasn't random. It was selection. There are countless people who receive clarity, who feel direction, who recognize what they are supposed to do. But when the moment comes to move, they hesitate, they delay, they negotiate with themselves. They wait for a better time, a clearer sign, a safer condition. And because of that, they never cross the line between knowing and doing. They remain in awareness without alignment, understanding without execution, and nothing shifts for them. But you did something different. You closed that gap. You moved when you could have waited. You acted when you could have postponed. You responded when you could have stayed silent. And that difference, that single decision to act instead of delay, is what placed you in a category that operates under a completely different level of movement. You weren't overlooked. You were recognized. There is a level where action is not measured by size, but by timing, where what matters is not how big the step is, but whether it was taken at the exact moment it was required. And what you did met that requirement. Because you didn't act early, you didn't act late. You acted at the point where hesitation would have been the default. And that is why it stands out. God does not respond to intention the same way he responds to execution. Because intention is common. Execution at the right time is rare. And rarity is what marks the chosen. You didn't just do something right. You did something rare. And that rarity created a shift that you are only beginning to feel now. Not as something dramatic or external yet, but as a change in how things respond to you. How situations begin to align without force. How certain obstacles that once felt solid now feel less fixed, less permanent. Because you have crossed the threshold that changes how movement happens around you. You weren't reacting. You were aligning. And alignment at that level does not go unnoticed. It is recorded. It is acknowledged. It is responded to. Not in a way that draws attention. Not in a way that announces itself publicly. But in a way that adjusts your path internally first. Because everything that happens externally follows what is established within. And what you established in that moment was clarity backed by action. This wasn't random. It was selection. There is a reason why it felt difficult to act, why there was resistance, why there was a moment where it would have been easier to step back, to wait, to choose comfort over movement. Because that is where the separation happens. That is where most people stop. And that is exactly where you moved forward. And that movement is what defines the difference. You didn't stay where you were. You stepped beyond it. And once you step beyond a certain point, you cannot return to the position you were in before. Not because you are forced forward, but because your awareness has already shifted. Your standard has already changed. Your identity has already adjusted to match what you just did. You are not the same. And you will not operate the same. Because you have now proven something. Not to others, but within the structure that guides your path. That when the moment comes, you will move. And that changes how everything begins to open for you. You weren't rejected. You were set apart.
Most people are waiting for something to happen before they act. You acted, and now things will begin to happen. That is the reversal. That is the shift. That is the difference between those who stay in delay and those who move into alignment. And you have already crossed into that movement. This is why what follows will feel different, not necessarily easier, but more direct, more responsive, more connected, because you are no longer out of sync with your own direction. You are moving with it. And when you move with it, resistance decreases, not because obstacles disappear completely, but because you are no longer creating additional resistance through hesitation. You are now aligned with your next step. And that changes everything. This wasn't random. It was selection. There is something else you need to understand clearly, because this is where many people lose momentum after doing something right. They assume that one action is enough, that one moment defines everything. But what you did was not an ending, it was an entry point. It was the moment that allowed the next phase to begin. And that phase requires consistency, not repetition of the same action, but consistency in the same level of alignment. You don't need to recreate that moment. You need to continue from it. Because what you did opened a path, but walking that path requires staying in the same state that allowed you to act in the first place. And that state is not forced, it is recognized. It is a state where you stop negotiating with clarity and start responding to it immediately. You didn't hesitate. And now you cannot return to hesitation without feeling it immediately. That is the difference. That is the confirmation. You are chosen. And now that you have crossed into that state, understand this with precision, because what follows is not random progression, but structured movement, meaning that once action has been taken at the correct moment, everything that comes after is no longer based on guesswork or trial. It is based on alignment continuing forward without interruption. And that is where most people fail. Not at the beginning, not at the moment of action, but immediately after. When they begin to question what they have already done, when they start to look back instead of forward, when they try to evaluate instead of continue. And that is exactly the point where momentum is either maintained or lost. You are not at the starting line anymore. You have already moved. And because you have moved, your position has changed, even if your surroundings have not fully reflected it yet. Because external change always follows internal alignment, not the other way around. And what you established internally through that action has already shifted the structure of what is possible for you next. This wasn't random, it was selection. There is a difference between someone who acts once and returns to hesitation and someone who acts and then continues without breaking alignment. And that difference is what determines whether that initial action becomes a turning point or just a temporary moment. And for you, this is where the decision continues, not in repeating the same action, but in maintaining the same level of response to clarity as it appears. Because clarity will appear again, not in the same form, not in the same situation, but at the same level. And when it does, the expectation does not reset. It continues. You are now operating at a level where delay is no longer neutral. It is immediately noticeable, immediately felt, immediately corrected. Because once you have proven that you can act when it matters, staying inactive becomes misalignment, not uncertainty. You weren't overlooked. You were advanced. And advancement is not a reward. It is a responsibility. Because now that you have stepped into alignment, you are expected to remain in it. Not perfectly, not without challenge, but consistently enough that your path continues to open instead of closing back into patterns you have already moved beyond. This is why what you feel now may not be excitement, but focus. Not relief, but awareness. Because you are no longer chasing something undefined. You are moving within something that has already been confirmed. And confirmation removes doubt, but increases responsibility. Because now you know. You know what it feels like to act correctly. You know what it feels like to respond at the right time. You know what it feels like to move without hesitation. And because you know that, you cannot return to not knowing. You weren't reacting. You were recognized. And recognition at this level does not mean attention. It means adjustment. It means that what surrounds you begins to reorganize in subtle ways. Opportunities shift. Timing adjusts. Interactions change. Not dramatically at first, but precisely. Because alignment does not create chaos. It creates order. And that order begins to reflect in how things unfold around you. You will notice it. Not immediately as something obvious, but as something that feels different. As if things are no longer as resistant. As if certain paths that once felt blocked now feel accessible. Not because they suddenly became easier, but because you are no longer out of position relative to them. You are aligned with them. This wasn't random. It was selection. There is something else that must be clear, because this is where many people lose what they have just gained. Not by doing something wrong externally, but by shifting internally. By allowing doubt to re-enter. By questioning whether what they did was enough. By trying to analyze instead of continuing. And that internal shift is what breaks alignment. Not circumstances, not obstacles, but hesitation returning after clarity has already been acted on. You do not need to re-evaluate what you have already executed correctly. You need to continue from it. Because alignment is not maintained by thinking about it. It is maintained by staying in motion with it. You have already proven that you can move. Now you are required to keep moving. Not constantly, not without rest, but without returning to the state of delay that existed before. That state is no longer yours. You have moved beyond it. You weren't rejected. You were set apart. And being set apart means you no longer operate under the same patterns, the same timing, the same reactions as those around you. It means your process is more exact, more responsive, more dependent on alignment than on external validation. And that difference will continue to become more visible the further you move from that initial moment of action. You will see it in how quickly things adjust. You will see it in how clearly you recognize what belongs and what does not. You will see it in how little tolerance you have for delay. Because delay now feels like regression. And you are not moving backward. You are moving forward. This wasn't random. It was selection. What you did was not just a decision. It was a confirmation of identity. And identity does not revert. It stabilizes. It continues. It expands. You are not trying to become someone who acts. You have already acted. And now you are someone who continues. That is the difference. That is the shift. That is the line you have crossed. You are chosen. And what is chosen does not act once and stop. It aligns and continues. And now that you understand that, there is no confusion left about what comes next. You move forward without returning to hesitation. Because that version of you is already behind you.